Welcome to my channel. Today, we journey into one of the most haunting aviation disasters ever to strike the heart of a city. This is the story of TAM Flight 3054, a flight that began like any other, a short domestic route, clear weather, experienced pilots, and an aircraft trusted by millions. But by the time it reached São Paulo, Brazil, the calm professionalism of the cockpit would turn to panic, the lights of the runway would blur into chaos, and the plane that was supposed to stop would instead become an unstoppable force of destruction. In the next few minutes, we will descend into a tale of human error, mechanical failure, and a moment that changed aviation forever. It was July evening, warm and quiet, the kind of night when airports hum with the rhythm of arrivals and departures. TAM Flight 3054, an Airbus A320, was preparing to leave Porto Alegre for São Paulo's Congonhas Airport, a short but tricky flight that pilots knew demanded precision. The captain, an experienced airman with thousands of hours in the sky, was calm as he completed his final checks. His first officer, younger but sharp, followed along methodically, calling out each item. Flaps set, engine stable, takeoff checklist complete. They had flown this route countless times, and the passengers, business travelers, families, and flight attendants ready to go home, had no reason to think this would be any different. The engines roared to life, and the aircraft lifted smoothly off the runway, climbing into the night. As the plane leveled out above the clouds, the cabin settled into routine. Flight attendants served drinks, passengers adjusted their seats, and laughter echoed faintly between rows. Outside, the world below was peaceful, clusters of city lights scattered across Brazil like distant stars. In the cockpit, the crew discussed weather at the destination. Congonhas Airport was infamous among pilots for its short runway, surrounded by dense urban neighborhood. It was a place that demanded perfection. There was no room for mistakes, no extra space to stop if something went wrong. But the weather was dry, and the captain felt confident. What he didn't know was that beneath the calm surface, a single switch setting, a seemingly minor detail, would set the stage for catastrophe. Approaching São Paulo, the crew received landing clearance. The control tower's voice was calm. TAM 3054, cleared to land runway 35 left, wind calm. The pilots began their descent, running through their landing checklist. Everything appeared normal. But as they extended the flaps and reduced power, a subtle inconsistency appeared on the engine control display. One throttle lever, engine 1, was pulled back to idle, but engine 2 remained in the climb position, still producing thrust. The captain noticed it but assumed it was a display glitch. After all, they had landed before with minor instrument irregularities. In reality, one of the thrust reversers, the mechanism that helps slow the aircraft upon touchdown, had been deactivated for maintenance. To prevent imbalance, procedures required the pilots to bring both throttles to idle during landing. But in the stress of preparation, that crucial step was overlooked. As the runway lights appeared ahead, shimmering like a path through the night, everything seemed under control. The passengers leaned forward slightly as the plane descended through the final approach, the sound of flaps adjusting echoing softly through the cabin. In the cockpit, the first officer called out the altitude markers. 150-30. The plane touched down firmly. The tires screamed against the asphalt. For a brief second, everything was fine. Then came confusion. The aircraft didn't decelerate. Instead, the engines roared louder. The captain instinctively pushed both levers to reverse, but the system misread the mismatched configuration. One engine spooled down, the other surged forward. The A320 accelerated. The brakes strained, the reverse thrust system faltered, and the runway began to vanish beneath them far too quickly. Inside the cockpit, the flight data recorder would later capture the chilling dialogue. "We're not slowing," shouted the first officer. "Brake," the captain responded. The alarm tone began blaring. The aircraft was running out of runway, fast. Outside, ground crew near the terminal watched in disbelief as the plane roared past the halfway mark, still at high speed. Inside, passengers began to sense something was wrong. The view from the windows showed lights rushing by far too quickly. A flight attendant braced against the galley wall, yelling for passengers to stay seated. Panic rippled through the cabin as the engines screamed, fighting against physics, against friction, against fate. The end of Congonha's runway loomed, a short strip bordered not by fields or open land, but by the crowded streets of São Paulo. The pilots tried one last desperate maneuver, pulling back the control column in an attempt to lift the nose and drag more friction from the tires, but it was too late. The jet burst through the airport fence, skidded across a busy highway, and slammed into a TAM cargo terminal across the street. The impact ignited a massive fireball that consumed the building instantly. For the people inside, there was no time to react. Flames tore through the wreckage, painting the night sky orange. Residents blocks away felt the heat. For miles, people stopped and turned toward the glow, realizing something terrible had happened. Within minutes, the airport emergency teams rushed to the scene, but the inferno was beyond control. Firefighters fought to contain it, but the heat was unbearable. The air smelled of burning fuel and metal, and the screams of sirens filled the city. News of the crash spread across Brazil within moments. Families watching the late-night news dropped everything when they heard the words, "TAM Flight 3054 has crashed on landing." It was the deadliest air disaster in the nation's history, and one of the most shocking the world had seen. As dawn broke over São Paulo, the fire still smoldered. All 187 people aboard the aircraft, and 12 more on the ground, were gone. Investigators arrived within hours, their faces grim as they picked through twisted fragments of metal. They knew this would not be a simple case. The runway had no safety overrun area, the rain from previous days had left the asphalt slick, and the aircraft's maintenance history was already raising questions. But the most haunting clue came from inside the cockpit, the configuration of the throttle levers. One idle, one forward. It was a small oversight that turned into catastrophe. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together the final moments with agonizing precision. They found that the right thrust lever had remained in the climb position during landing, while the left engine's reverse thrust was deployed. This imbalance caused the aircraft to veer and accelerate, effectively turning it into a missile the moment it touched the ground. The pilots, realizing too late what had happened, had only seconds to respond. There was nothing they could do. They were trained for emergencies, for fire, for engine failure, but not for a situation like this, where the system itself fought against their every command. Public outrage exploded. How could a runway in a major city lack a buffer zone? How could an aircraft be cleared to land with a thrust reverser disabled? How could such a simple configuration error bring down an advanced airliner? The answers were painful. It wasn't one failure, it was a chain. A combination of maintenance policies, human error, and a dangerous assumption that nothing would go wrong. The investigators' final report would later call it an avoidable tragedy born from oversight. But for the families of the victims, no technical explanation could fill the void. Memorials were built near the site of the crash, their surfaces engraved with names that would never be forgotten. The terminal was rebuilt, but the scars remained, not just on the ground, but in the hearts of a nation. The crash forced sweeping changes in runway safety worldwide. Engine configurations were redesigned, new warning systems were introduced, and airports around the world reviewed their layouts, ensuring there would always be space, somewhere, for an aircraft that couldn't stop. Years later, survivors from nearby buildings still remembered the night the sky fell. One man, who had been working in a shop across the street, described it best. "It sounded like thunder," he said. "But when I looked up, it wasn't the sky that was breaking, it was everything we thought was safe." The tragedy of TAM Flight 3054 remains one of aviation's darkest reminders that even the smallest oversight can carry unimaginable consequences. Every button, every lever, every line in a checklist exists because someone, somewhere, paid for it with their life. And that is the real weight of flight, not just the science that keeps planes in the air, but the humility that keeps them from falling again. Thank you for watching. If stories like this remind you why every detail matters, why safety is written in sacrifice, please subscribe to the channel. Together, we honor those who lost their lives, not by remembering how they fell, but by ensuring we never stop learning from why. The day after the crash, Sao Paulo woke beneath a thick, gray haze that smelled of smoke and jet fuel. The fire at the TAM cargo terminal had burned through the night, and firefighters were still battling small flare-ups in the early morning hours. The sun tried to rise over the skyline, but the air was filled with ash, and the city's heart felt as though it had stopped beating. Across Brazil, news channels replayed the same devastating footage: the bright orange fireball consuming the terminal, the screams of onlookers, the blaring of sirens. It was the country's worst aviation disaster, and in the silence that followed the chaos, only one question remained: how could this have happened? Investigators from the Centro de Investigação e Prevenção de Acidentes Aeronáuticos, CENIPA, arrived before dawn, joined by experts from Airbus and the National Transportation Safety Board. Their faces were expressionless as they walked through the debris field. Twisted fragments of fuselage were scattered across the street, charred remains of cars lined the road, and melted aluminum clung to the concrete like wax. Inside the hangar-like terminal, the smell was overwhelming, a mixture of burned rubber, fuel, and something heavier that no one wanted to identify. Every step crunched on shattered glass and scorched plastic. The lead investigator, Colonel Marcelo Silva, had seen tragedy before, but nothing like this. He paused at what used to be the nose section of the aircraft, now crushed and folded inward, blackened beyond recognition. Nearby, they found part of the main landing gear, jammed, scorched, but mostly intact. "Get samples from the brake assemblies," he ordered quietly. "If the brakes failed, this will tell us why." His voice trembled only once, when he glanced toward a wall where firefighters had draped a tarp to conceal what lay beneath. As the morning unfolded, families began gathering outside the airport gates. Many had been waiting since the night before, desperate for any sign of hope, clutching printed manifests and photographs. Airport officials moved among them, their words careful, their faces pale. Some relatives shouted, demanding answers. Others simply stood motionless, unable to speak. The grief was collective, spreading through the crowd like electricity. Across the street, candles began to appear along the fences, flickering in the cold wind. Reporters swarmed the area, their cameras trained on every tear, every embrace. The image of one woman collapsing to her knees after hearing her husband's name confirmed as lost would become the defining photograph of the tragedy, an image that would haunt a nation. Inside the investigation center, the black boxes had been found early that morning. They were damaged but intact, their bright orange paint dulled by soot. Technicians carefully loaded them into protective cases and prepared them for analysis. Every investigator knew that whatever was inside those recorders would reveal the final seconds of Flight 3054, the voices of two men who had tried everything to save their aircraft, the tone of alarms, the mechanical groans of a jet refusing to obey. The room fell silent as the data began to download. The cockpit voice recording started calmly. The familiar hum of engines, the static crackle of radio communication, and the routine chatter between the captain and first officer. Weather clear. Visibility good. Runway dry, the first officer said. The captain responded, "Copy that. We'll be light on landing. Should be a smooth one." Their tone was relaxed, almost cheerful. But as the tape progressed, the mood changed. At the 1-minute mark before touchdown, the first officer noted, "Right thrust levers stuck in climb." The captain replied, "It's fine, reverser disabled. We'll compensate." Then came the touchdown, 2 quick jolts and the unmistakable sound of engines spooling up. "We're not slowing," one of them shouted. The alarms began wailing. "Reverse! Reverse!" Static filled the last few seconds, followed by a single, sharp exhale and then silence. In another room, the flight data recorder revealed what the cockpit voices could not. Graphs and numbers told a story of contradiction. The aircraft touched down at normal speed, but within seconds, one engine was still producing full thrust while the other was in idle reverse. The braking system, overwhelmed by the asymmetry, failed to slow the plane. The aircraft had become a trapped force, a 60-ton machine fighting itself while sliding down a runway that offered no forgiveness. As the findings were shared among the team, silence fell again. Someone whispered, "They never stood a chance." Colonel Silva rubbed his temples, staring at the data. "One thrust lever forward," he muttered. "Just one. The tiniest mistake. A lever left in the wrong detent, a procedure skipped under routine pressure, had unleashed catastrophe." But Silva wasn't satisfied yet. There had to be more. Even with asymmetrical thrust, he said, they should have had space to stop. Why didn't they? To answer that, the investigators visited the runway itself. Congonhas Airport, perched in the middle of São Paulo, was a marvel of engineering and controversy. The main runway was short, barely enough for a large jet to land safely under perfect conditions. And on both sides, the city pressed close. Highways, gas stations, and offices just beyond the airport fence. The runway had been resurfaced only months before the crash, after years of complaints about poor drainage and slippery conditions. But the friction tests from recent days showed another problem. Thin layers of standing water formed easily, reducing braking performance dramatically. Combined with the plane's imbalance, it was a recipe for disaster. The colonel's notebook filled with grim equations. Wet asphalt, asymmetric thrust, short runway, no overrun area. Everything added up to tragedy. That evening, when he faced the press, his words were measured but heavy. "This was not one error," he said. "It was many. A chain that began long before the aircraft touched the runway." Behind him, reporters shouted for more details, but he refused to speculate further. He knew the truth was still unraveling. Back in the city, mourning turned into anger. The people wanted accountability. Candlelight vigils filled the streets, and at night, the glow of hundreds of flames reflected off the airport walls. Pilots from around the world sent condolences, calling for stricter regulations on urban airports. Inside the TAM headquarters, executives held emergency meetings, their faces drawn. They promised full cooperation, but whispers circulated among employees. Rumors that maintenance crews had long complained about thrust reverser procedures being misunderstood or ignored. Mechanics spoke quietly to investigators, their hands shaking as they signed statements. "We knew it could happen one day," one admitted. "But not like this. Not this way." By the third day, the entire crash site had been cleared, leaving behind only blackened concrete and scorch marks. The air still smelled faintly of aviation fuel, a scent that seemed to seep into everything. For São Paulo's residents, the sight of the destroyed terminal was unbearable. People avoided driving near it, lowering their voices when they passed. It wasn't just a scene of death. It was a reminder that something so routine, so familiar, could turn catastrophic in seconds. In the control tower, air traffic controllers replayed their own recordings again and again, haunted by what they'd heard. TAM 3054, cleared to land, runway 35 left, the controller's calm voice said, followed by silence after the touchdown. Then the sudden roar, the alarms, and the final burst of static. One controller admitted later that he froze for a full 10 seconds after realizing the aircraft wasn't stopping. "It looked like a comet," he said, voice trembling. "It went past the runway lights and vanished into fire." Within a week, the entire country demanded reform. Officials ordered emergency inspections of the runway drainage, friction, and every aircraft operating with a deactivated thrust reverser. Airlines retrained pilots overnight, emphasizing configuration discipline during landing. Yet, even with the new precautions, no one could shake the sense that something bigger had failed. that the system designed to protect life had chosen convenience over caution. As investigators continued their work, they found something chilling buried deep in the cockpit procedures manual. A single paragraph, buried on page 273, explained how to handle landings with a deactivated thrust reverser, but the text was ambiguous. It did not clearly warn pilots that leaving one lever in the climb position could cancel reverse thrust entirely. It was a quiet flaw, one that had passed through revisions, approvals, and audits without ever raising a red flag. Now, it had taken nearly 200 lives to reveal itself. Late that night, Colonel Silva stood outside the hangar, staring at the skyline of São Paulo. The city lights twinkled like stars, reflected faintly in his eyes. He thought of the passengers, parents, students, children, strangers sharing one ordinary flight. He thought of the crew who fought to the very last second, and of the families who would wake every day wondering why the sky had turned against them. "We'll find it," he whispered. "We'll find every reason, and we'll make sure the world listens." But even as he said the words, he knew that no report, no investigation, no diagram could ever capture what had truly been lost. The silence that followed the fire, the lives interrupted mid-sentence, the city that had watched an airplane become a tragedy written in flame. By the end of the first week, the investigation into TAM Flight 3054 had shifted from recovery to revelation. The grief that had blanketed São Paulo was slowly giving way to a grim determination. Investigators worked day and night, piecing together every moment of that doomed landing second by second, frame by frame, sound by sound. They analyzed the flight data recorder until the numbers became muscle memory, replayed the cockpit voice tapes until the pilots' final cries etched themselves into their dreams. The entire world wanted answers, but the people searching for them already knew that answers would not come easily, because this was not a single mistake. This was the story of an entire system collapsing in silence. The hangar where the wreckage was stored had been transformed into a map of destruction. Every recovered piece of Flight 3054 was carefully tagged and arranged on a massive grid floor, each twisted panel and melted wire revealing another piece of the puzzle. The left wing's underside bore the deep scars of intense heat. The landing gear had melted into the tarmac. The cockpit instrumentation was almost completely destroyed. But the most crucial evidence came from the power management panel, specifically, the position of the throttle levers at the moment of impact. When investigators examined the levers closely, their suspicions were confirmed. The right throttle was jammed in the CL climb position, while the left had been pulled fully back to idle. It was the mechanical proof of a cockpit error that had turned lethal. But for lead investigator Colonel Marcelo Silva, it wasn't enough to know what went wrong. He needed to know why. How could two experienced pilots, one a captain with thousands of flight hours, make a mistake so basic, so catastrophic? The deeper he looked, the clearer it became that this wasn't simply about the crew. This was about how routine breeds complacency, how small details are lost in the fog of familiarity. TAM Flight 3054 had been operating with one engine's thrust reverser deactivated for maintenance, a common and legally permitted condition. The crew had flown that way before. It wasn't unusual. They were trained for it. But what the manuals and training materials failed to emphasize was the risk that came if the throttles weren't perfectly aligned at touchdown. The A320's computer logic interpreted the mixed input as a command to keep one engine producing forward thrust even as the other went into reverse. It was a design that assumed pilots would always act perfectly, and that assumption had cost 199 lives. Silva's team replayed the final seconds of the flight again and again. The data showed that when the aircraft's wheels touched down, the spoilers, the panels on the wings that help slow the plane, didn't deploy automatically as they should have. The computer had detected the mismatched throttle positions and, confused by the conflicting signals, refused to activate them. That meant the full weight of the aircraft wasn't pressing onto the brake. The A320 was essentially skating across the wet runway with only partial drag, one engine still pushing forward. Every move the pilots made to slow down only worsened the imbalance. When the captain slammed the pedals, the wheels locked. The plane's speed barely changed. From touchdown to disaster, less than 30 seconds passed. While investigators worked, the public's patience ran thin. Television anchors demanded accountability. Newspaper headlines screamed accusations. Why didn't they stop? Who let them land? Politicians called emergency meetings, some blaming the airline, others blaming the airport's location. And through it all, the families waited. Many refused to leave the temporary morgue where DNA testing was being done, desperate to bring their loved ones home. Each day, the sound of wailing mothers and broken fathers echoed through the hallways, a chorus of grief that even the investigators could not shut out. Some of them stopped eating, others barely slept. One investigator confided to a colleague, "You start to imagine their faces when you hold a piece of the fuselage. You can't help it." But amidst the emotional weight, a few key leads began to surface. Maintenance records revealed that just weeks before the crash, several TAM pilots had filed informal reports complaining about the Airbus A320's thrust lever design and the confusing checklist procedure when operating with a disabled reverser. Those reports were never escalated to engineering review. They sat in a database marked non-critical feedback. In the months leading up to the crash, there had even been 2 minor runway overrun incidents involving other airlines at Congonhas under similar weather conditions. Both were dismissed as pilot error. No one connected the dots. Colonel Silva called for an emergency summit. Representatives from Airbus, TAM Airlines, Brazil's Aviation Authority, and the International Civil Aviation Organization gathered in a dimly lit conference room overlooking the skyline of São Paulo. Outside, storm clouds brewed, the kind that mirrored the tension inside. "This was not one man's mistake," Silva began. "This was a failure of communication between machine, procedure, and human expectation." He clicked through slides showing the throttle positions, the computer logic flow, and the lack of warnings in the manual. "The pilots were trained for reverser failure," he continued, "but nowhere does the manual state that asymmetric thrust in this configuration would override braking logic. They didn't know they were fighting the plane's own systems." The room fell silent. A representative from Airbus finally spoke. "The system was designed to prevent pilot error." Silva's jaw tightened. "And yet it killed them." As the meeting dragged on, it became clear that no single entity wanted to take the blame. The airline argued that the pilots failed to follow standard operating procedure. Airbus maintained that their systems had worked as designed. The Aviation Authority insisted that the runway met safety requirements. But Silva knew the truth lay somewhere between them. The runway's lack of a runoff area meant that even the smallest landing miscalculation could become deadly. The short runway, wet conditions, thrust asymmetry, and flawed procedure combined into a perfect storm, one that could strike anywhere, anytime, unless the world learned from it. Outside the bureaucracy, the emotional fallout deepened. Vigils turned into protests. Families marched to Congress carrying photos of loved ones, chanting, "Nunca mais, never again." The TAM headquarters in São Paulo became a shrine, its walls covered in flowers, letters, and photographs. The city itself seemed to mourn. The hum of daily life slowed, and every time a jet roared overhead, people paused and looked up with unease. For the first time, the public began questioning the very idea of airports being built in the middle of dense cities. Congonhas, once a symbol of convenience, was now a symbol of tragedy. Weeks later, when the preliminary report was released, it confirmed much of what the investigation had suspected. The right throttle lever was in the climb position during touchdown, causing one engine to keep producing thrust while the other engaged reverse. The ground spoilers failed to deploy, and braking efficiency was drastically reduced. The wet runway provided almost no friction. The plane's speed increased instead of decreasing, leading to a catastrophic overrun. But the report also made something else clear. It was time for global change. The recommendation section demanded updates to pilot training worldwide, revisions to Airbus procedures, and mandatory installation of runway safety zones in urban airports. Still, for those who had lost family, the report offered little comfort. Facts did not replace faces. Diagrams did not silence nightmares. When the investigators held a private briefing for the victims' families, many could not bear to hear the details. One mother stood up midway through, tears streaming down her face. "You keep saying runway, thrust, procedure," she said. "But my daughter was only 9. She didn't know what any of that meant. All she knew was that she was going home." The room went silent. Even the most hardened officials lowered their heads. After the meeting, Silva sat alone in his car for a long time, staring at the rain streaking down his windshield. He thought of that little girl, of the captain who fought until the very end, of the hundreds of small, preventable decisions that had led them all here. The city lights shimmered in the puddles outside, distorted and trembling. He whispered to himself, "They trusted us." That sentence became the guiding principle of the final report, the one that would go on to reshape Brazilian aviation. In the following months, the airport underwent significant renovations. Grooved runways were installed to improve water drainage, and new safety barriers were planned to stop overrunning aircraft. Pilots were retrained on asymmetric thrust emergencies. Airbus introduced a new software update for all A320 models, ensuring that mismatched throttles would trigger a direct cockpit warning and prevent automatic system confusion. The lessons learned from TAM Flight 3054 would eventually ripple across the world, making every landing a little safer. But inside the investigation office, even after the work was done, a strange silence lingered. Colonel Silva would sometimes walk through the hangar late at night, where the remains of Flight 3054 were still stored in shadowed corners. He would run his hand over the blackened metal, feeling the cold surface beneath his fingertips. "You should have stopped," he whispered once. "You should have stopped." It wasn't blame. It was grief, the kind that never quite left. And as São Paulo slowly healed, as the scars of flame faded from the terminal walls and the city's rhythm returned, the ghost of Flight 3054 remained. Every time a jet approached Congonhas at dusk, the reflection of its landing lights glimmered across the same stretch of asphalt where the tragedy had unfolded years before. For those who remembered, it was a quiet reminder of how fragile safety truly is, and how close the line between control and catastrophe can be. By the second month of the investigation, the hangar that held the remains of TAM Flight 3054 had become a place of quiet reverence, a mix between a laboratory and a memorial. The wreckage was still laid out meticulously across the floor, every bolt, beam, and scorched panel tagged and documented. Teams of engineers, metallurgists, and analysts moved carefully among the fragments, studying every mark left by the fire and the violent impact. It was no longer just about solving a mystery, it was about understanding the sequence of human and mechanical decisions that had led to this catastrophe. Outside, São Paulo continued to mourn. Every evening, candles still burned at the gates of Congonhas Airport. Families still gathered, not out of hope but out of a need to remember. The city was healing, but slowly, its heart still scarred by that night when the sky fell onto its street. Inside the investigation room, progress came in painful inches. Every piece of data confirmed what the investigators already suspected, but it was the context that haunted them. When the captain of Flight 3054 brought the aircraft in for landing, everything had appeared normal, until the very moment the wheels touched the ground. From that instant onward, chaos unfolded faster than any human could have processed. The first officer, barely 30, had been the first to realize something was wrong. He'd shouted, "No reverse," as alarms began flashing, his voice filled with disbelief. The captain tried to correct, pulling back the levers, applying full brakes, but the aircraft's computer refused to comply. The automation, meant to protect them, had sealed their fate. It interpreted the right throttle's forward position as intentional power, disabling both reversers entirely. In the space of less than 10 seconds, the plane had gone from controlled landing to uncontrollable acceleration. To anyone unfamiliar with aviation, the sequence might sound too simple, too small a mistake to cause so much destruction. But that was what made it so terrifying. This wasn't a case of recklessness or weather or mechanical breakdown. It was the perfect storm of human habit and technological trust colliding. Colonel Silva, who now led the inquiry board, couldn't stop thinking about that one moment, the second where routine became fatal. He often stayed behind after everyone else had gone home, staring at the last few lines of the flight data graph. Speed rising, pressure dropping, brakes heating until they failed. It wasn't noise, it was a heartbeat. The heartbeat of a dying aircraft fighting against physics. Weeks later, new evidence arrived from TAM's maintenance records, and what it revealed added yet another layer to the tragedy. The aircraft had been cleared for operation with one thrust reverser deactivated, a legal but risky configuration. TAM's internal documentation confirmed that the captain had received the briefing. He was supposed to ensure that both throttle levers were set to idle before landing. But under pressure, and with hundreds of flights under similar conditions, it had become routine to rely on habit. On previous flights, the difference between the levers hadn't caused any issue, until this one. The realization sent a shiver through the team. The error wasn't just the pilots, it was a culture's. A system that had quietly learned to treat rules as suggestions, trusting that nothing bad would happen until one day it did. At the same time, attention turned back to Kongenha's airport itself. Investigators began examining its infrastructure, and what they found only deepened the unease. The runway at Kongenha's was infamously short, barely 2,000 meters, and surrounded by dense urban sprawl. Pilots often described it as landing on a postage stamp. Worse, the runway had been resurfaced shortly before the crash with a new asphalt compound meant to improve friction during rain. But post-crash tests revealed that the grooves meant to drain water had not yet been cut. The surface was smooth, too smooth, and when it rained, it created a thin film of water that turned the tarmac into something like polished glass. That night, a drizzle had passed through São Paulo just hours before Flight 3054 landed. To the untrained eye, the runway looked dry. In reality, it was deadly. Colonel Silva wrote in his report, had the runway been grooved, the aircraft might have stopped within the limits. The lack of friction transformed a recoverable situation into an unrecoverable one. It was another link in the chain. Every factor, each small, individually survivable, had connected perfectly into tragedy. The more the team uncovered, the heavier the air grew inside the investigation center. What haunted them wasn't incompetence, but how ordinary everything had been. Every person involved had done what they were trained to do, every rule had been technically followed, and yet, in the end, it had not been enough. Outside of the investigation, public outrage turned political. Lawmakers began arguing about the safety of Kongenha's airport, with some demanding it be shut down entirely. Others defended it as an irreplaceable economic hub. The news media ran nightly reports showing computer simulations of the crash, graphics of a digital aircraft hurtling off the runway, over the highway, into the terminal. They replayed it so often that people began avoiding watching the news altogether. It was too painful, too repetitive, like reopening a wound that refused to heal. Meanwhile, inside TAM's corporate offices, executives faced their own reckoning. Families of the victims filed lawsuits, accusing the company of negligence. Whistleblowers came forward, admitting that pilots had long complained about the airport's dangerous layout and unclear procedures regarding thrust reversers. The airline's CEO appeared on national television, his voice trembling as he said, "We are deeply sorry. We will carry this burden forever." But to the families, it sounded hollow. Words couldn't rebuild what had been lost. They wanted change, not condolences. For the investigation team, the final breakthrough came when Airbus engineers joined forces with Cenepa to reconstruct the cockpit control logic in a simulator. Using real flight data, they recreated the exact landing conditions of Flight 3054. As the simulated aircraft touched down, the same thing happened. The system ignored the pilot's braking commands. The asymmetric throttle position canceled reverse thrust and ground spoilers, leaving the plane sliding helplessly forward. When Silva watched the simulation play out in front of him, he clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. "There it is," he said quietly. "That's the moment everything went wrong." The engineers froze the simulation on the final frame, an image of the plane just before it crossed the runway's end light. The numbers on the display told the rest. Speed 174 knot. Braking power 0. It was a death sentence delivered by a machine following logic it believed was correct. The findings would lead to sweeping reforms. Airbus released immediate updates to the A320's flight software, adding a system safeguard that automatically triggered full spoiler deployment even with mismatched throttles. Congonhas Airport underwent urgent resurfacing, finally cutting grooves into its runways to restore friction. The Brazilian government introduced new safety rules requiring runoff zones for all major airports. But as with every disaster, these changes arrived too late for those already lost. In the months that followed, the families of the victims built their own memorial near the crash site. A quiet stone monument engraved with the names of every passenger and crew member stood facing the rebuilt terminal. Every July, hundreds gathered to place flowers there. Children who had lost parents, parents who had lost children, colleagues, friends, all united by one tragedy. For them, it wasn't about blame anymore, it was about remembrance. One evening, after the final report was published, Colonel Silva returned alone to the site. The terminal had been rebuilt, brighter, cleaner, busier. But as he stood there, the echoes of that night still seemed to hum beneath the surface. He could almost hear the engines, the alarms, the rising panic in the cockpit. He closed his eyes, feeling the city around him, alive, loud, oblivious. "You've given us your warning," he whispered. "We heard you." As he walked away, the last of the sunlight reflected off a landing aircraft descending onto the same runway. The plane touched down smoothly, its tires squealing lightly before settling into a steady roll. It slowed perfectly, safely, its lights blinking as it taxied toward the gate. To every ordinary traveler on board, it was just another landing. But to Silva, it was proof that even in tragedy's wake, humanity learns. The ghosts of TAM Flight 3054 were still there, but they no longer screamed, they guided. And above the city that had once burned, the sound of engines faded peacefully into the night. By the time the final stages of the investigation began, the energy inside the Cenepa headquarters had shifted from confusion to clarity, but clarity didn't bring comfort. Every detail that had once been uncertain was now a painful certainty. The full picture of what happened to TAM Flight 3054 had emerged, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. Every discovery, every diagram, every final moment from the flight data recorder painted a portrait of inevitability, one in which dozens of small, permissible flaws had aligned to create a tragedy no one could stop. The press had already named it, the flight that never slowed. To the investigators, though, it had become something deeper, a reminder of how fragile human systems truly are when they begin to trust themselves too much. Colonel Marcelo Silva stood before the reconstructed wreckage for the last time. The aircraft's remains had been rearranged into their approximate shape, a mangled skeleton of metal and wire. There was a reverent silence in the hangar, broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Silva ran his hand along a scorched piece of fuselage, remembering the faces of the crew he had seen in their personnel files. The captain, a veteran nearing retirement, respected by his peers, a father of two. The first officer, a young pilot who had once written in his logbook that flying made him feel infinite. Neither of them had made a single reckless decision. Both had done exactly what training and procedure demanded. And yet, in the end, they had been betrayed by the system that was supposed to protect them. When the final analysis came together, the report ran nearly 600 pages. It was both a technical document and an autopsy of accountability. It concluded that the root cause of the crash was the asymmetrical position of the throttles upon landing, specifically, the right lever's climb setting and the left lever's idle setting. That mismatch had overridden reverse thrust and spoiler deployment, drastically reducing braking power. But the report didn't stop there. It described a cascade of contributing factors that stretched back years. An airport that had been allowed to operate without proper runoff zones, an airline that normalized risky maintenance practices, and a manufacturer that had designed an aircraft too confident in its own automation. When the draft was reviewed by international regulators, even the representatives from Airbus were quiet. The engineer leading their team spoke softly. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The system was meant to think faster than the human mind. Silva replied coldly, it did. And that's exactly why they died. He didn't say it out of malice. It was a statement of fact. Automation had done what it was told, but not what was needed. The final report's release drew worldwide attention. Journalists from every continent gathered at the press conference in Brasilia, their cameras trained on the podium as Silva took the stage. He wasn't a man of spectacle. His tone was measured, almost weary. "We have finished our work," he began. "We have traced every signal, every action, every failure. And what we found was not a single error, but a chain of decisions, made in good faith, yet blind to consequence. This was not an act of fate. It was preventable." The room fell silent as he outlined the findings, his words carrying both precision and sorrow. When he finished, one journalist stood and asked, "Colonel, do you think the pilots could have done anything differently?" Silva paused, looking at the sea of faces before him. "Yes," he said quietly. "They could have been told the truth about how their aircraft worked." The aftermath of the report shook the global aviation community. Airbus immediately issued updated procedures for all A320 operators, mandating explicit warnings about throttle configuration. Pilots received new training to handle asymmetric reverser conditions. Airports around the world reviewed their runway designs and friction standards, ensuring proper grooves and safety zones. The Brazilian government, under public pressure, announced that Congonhas Airport would finally undergo a full modernization program. The runway was resurfaced, its drainage improved, and the terminal expanded with better evacuation routes. It was progress born of pain. But for the families, progress offered no solace. When the report was made public, they gathered again at the crash site, holding printed copies of the conclusions as though clutching proof that their loved ones hadn't died in vain. Some wept, others simply stared at the pages in silence. One man, whose wife had been a flight attendant on Flight 3054, read a single line aloud. "This accident could have been prevented." His voice cracked halfway through the sentence, but he forced himself to finish. "That's all we wanted," he said softly. To know someone finally said it. In the months that followed, time moved forward, but the scars remained visible. The rebuilt TAM terminal gleamed with new glass and steel, but on the street outside, a small memorial garden had been built, a simple circle of stone engraved with the names of all 199 victims. Every year, on July 17th, people gathered there. They came not just to mourn, but to remind themselves of what had been learned at such a terrible cost. Air traffic controllers from Congonhas often stopped by after their shifts, leaving flowers. Pilots on layovers came in uniform to bow their heads, and sometimes the investigators themselves returned quietly, standing apart from the crowd, saying nothing. For Silva, retirement came a few years later, though it didn't feel like an ending. The lessons of Flight 3054 followed him everywhere, in every takeoff he watched, in every smooth landing that disappeared into the distance. Sometimes, on his evening walks, he'd pause to look up at the sky and listen to the faint echo of engines. He once told a journalist who visited him, "Every safe flight after 3054 is part of their legacy. That's how I make peace with it." He kept the black box transcript in his study, tucked inside a folder labeled Voices. Some nights, when the memories grew too heavy, he would read it again, not out of morbid fascination, but as a ritual of remembrance. He imagined the captain's hands on the controls, the first officer's steady voice, the desperate final seconds of teamwork. To him, those men weren't defined by their mistake, but by how fiercely they tried to save their passengers. Even as the alarms blared and the runway blurred beneath them, they never gave up. They fought gravity, friction, and failure to the very end. That, he thought, was courage, the kind most people never see. Years later, the aviation world would look back on Flight 3054 as a turning point. Textbooks would call it a case study in human-machine interaction, in how safety evolves through error. But to the people who lived it, it was a wound that taught humility. Every checklist revision, every engineering update, every simulator training session carried the invisible fingerprints of those 199 souls. They had become part of aviation's DNA. One day, long after his retirement, Silva received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a letter from a young pilot who had just completed her certification on the A320. She wrote, "I wanted to thank you. Because of what your team learned, I now understand my aircraft in ways the pilots before me didn't. We study Flight 3054 every year. We don't just learn the procedures, we learn the responsibility. We owe them that." He folded the letter carefully and set it on his desk beside the worn folder marked Voices. Outside, the sound of a distant jet rolled through the air. He watched it climb higher and higher until it vanished into the clouds, a silver streak against the fading light. For a moment, he thought of all the names carved into the memorial stone, all the stories that ended that night in Sao Paulo. And for the first time in many years, he smiled. Not because he'd found peace, but because their story had finally found meaning. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, Silva whispered to himself, "You couldn't stop, but because of you we did." It was a quiet prayer to the lost, a final salute to the flight that refused to be forgotten. Above him, another plane crossed the sky, its lights steady and bright, a symbol of everything humanity had learned and everything it still had to remember. When the final report on TAM Flight 3054 was officially released to the world, it marked the end of one of the most painful investigations in Brazilian aviation history. Yet for those who had lived every second of it, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the closing of a wound that would never fully heal. The truth was now undeniable. Flight 3054 had fallen victim to a perfect chain of small, avoidable failures. Each one, in isolation, seemed harmless, but together, they had created a tragedy that could never be undone. For the investigators, the report meant closure. For the families, it meant confirmation. And for the city of Sao Paulo, it meant that the ghosts of that night would forever linger in the air above Congonhas Airport. Months after the release, the airport was once again alive with travelers, its polished floors gleaming under bright lights, its runways now grooved and improved. People hurried through terminals with luggage in hand, chatting about vacations and business trips, unaware that just beyond the glass walls stood a memorial, a circle of stone engraved with the names of 199 souls who had never made it home. Every morning, before the first departure, a small crew of airport workers would pass by that memorial. Some stopped for a moment, laying a flower or touching a nameplate before returning to their shift. For them, the tragedy wasn't history. It was a daily reminder of what could happen if even one link in the safety chain broke again. Colonel Marcelo Silva had retired quietly months after the investigation concluded, but the memory of Flight 3054 followed him like a shadow. He lived alone in a modest apartment not far from the city, surrounded by stacks of reports and aviation journals. He often woke before dawn, drawn to the balcony whenever he heard the faint roar of jet engines overhead. From there, he could see the faint blinking of aircraft lights gliding across the horizon, tiny symbols of progress, trust, and human frailty. He didn't watch them with fear. He watched them with reverence. Every safe landing felt like a victory for the people who'd perished that night. Their loss had reshaped an entire industry. Their silence had become the reason for new voices of safety across the skies. Late one evening, Silva received an invitation to a ceremony at Congonhas Airport. It was to commemorate the unveiling of the new safety system, a state-of-the-art runway arrestor bed, designed to stop any aircraft that overran the runway. The irony was not lost on him. This technology, long debated and delayed, had finally been installed because of the very tragedy that had taken so many lives. He almost didn't go, but curiosity and duty pulled him there. When he arrived, the crowd was smaller than expected. A few journalists, airport officials, and several families of the victims stood near the newly built system, its pale concrete shining under the floodlights. As speeches were given, Silva stood quietly in the back, hands clasped behind his back. When the microphone was finally passed to him, he didn't read from the notes he had prepared. Instead, he spoke from the heart. "Safety is not born from technology," he said, his voice steady. "It's born from remembrance. If we forget why this was built, then we've already failed those we lost." The audience fell silent, and when he stepped away, several family members approached him with tears in their eyes, whispering thank you. After the ceremony, he walked toward the memorial one last time. The evening was still, the city lights reflecting faintly off the wet tarmac. He placed his hand on one of the engraved names, a young girl's, and whispered, "You stopped falling. We learned to land again." Then he stood in silence, listening. Somewhere overhead, another aircraft began its descent. Its landing lights shimmered through the mist, its wheels touching down softly on the same runway that had once betrayed Flight 3054. The hum of the engines grew louder for a moment, then faded into calm as the plane slowed to a smooth stop. Silva felt a strange peace in that sound. It was proof that their suffering had not been in vain. Elsewhere, inside TAM Airlines Training Center, a new generation of pilots studied a simulation titled Case Study, Flight 3054. They watched the reconstructed landing sequence, the throttle error, the failed deceleration. But their instructors didn't just teach the technical lessons. They spoke of the human ones. They taught about communication, decision-making under pressure, and the importance of questioning procedures. This, the instructor would say, pointing to the frozen image of the A320 sliding down the runway, is why we never assume. This is why we always listen to that voice inside that says something isn't right. Those pilots carried that lesson into every flight, ensuring that the past stayed alive not as fear, but as awareness. For the families, healing took different forms. Some turned their grief into advocacy, founding organizations that fought for better aviation safety standard. Others simply returned each year to the memorial, their visits quiet but steadfast. Every July 17th, the memorial filled with flowers, candles, and prayers. No one needed to speak much. The air itself carried the memory. A mother might trace her son's name on the stone and smile faintly, saying, "They remember you." A retired air traffic controller might pause to bow his head, murmuring, "We won't let it happen again." The tragedy had long since left the headlines, but it never left their hearts. As the years passed, Flight 3054 became more than a case file. It became a turning point in aviation culture. Every new safety reform, every design improvement, every runway inspection held a silent echo of that night in Sao Paulo. When international conferences on aviation safety cited examples of progress, Flight 3054 was always mentioned, not as a failure but as the reason for change. It became proof that from loss could come renewal. One rainy afternoon many years later, as Silva sat by his window with a cup of coffee, he turned on the television. A documentary was airing, an anniversary special on Flight 3054. He watched the old footage with quiet detachment at first, until the screen showed an image of the final memorial ceremony. His younger self appeared briefly, speaking to the crowd. He looked so tired, he thought. But when the program ended, the narrator's final words caught him off guard. From tragedy rose reform. From silence rose safety. The story of Flight 3054 is the story of how humanity learns, even in its darkest moments. Silva set down his cup, closed his eyes, and smiled faintly. Outside, another plane roared through the clouds, its landing lights glimmering like stars. He listened as it descended safely into Kongenhas, the sound fading softly into the city's heartbeat. For the world, it was just another arrival. For him, it was a whisper from the past, a gentle reminder that every safe landing carried the memory of those who could not stop. And as the night deepened, the old investigator whispered one final sentence, not for the cameras, not for the records, but for himself. They couldn't stop that night, but because of them, the rest of us do. He turned off the light, leaving the city glowing beneath the clouds. The hum of airplanes continued, steady and strong, a living requiem for Flight 3054, echoing forever through the skies they died protecting.